Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to our continuing series of Preserve Minnesota 2020 webinars. Thank you for joining us today. Just a couple of words before we get started. Participant microphones are muted for the webinar, so please use the Q&A panel to ask questions, and we will have time at the end to answer those questions. And we are recording this today, and the recording will be available most likely this afternoon off of our website. And this morning, Leslie Coburn from the Minnesota State Historic Preservation Office is going to handle our introductions.
Good morning, everyone. On behalf of the State Historic Preservation Office, it's my pleasure to welcome you to the 40th Annual Preserve Minnesota Conference and our 5th of 6 sessions. I'm Leslie Coburn, Environmental Review Coordinator with the State Historic Preservation Office, or SHPO, and I'm speaking to you from SHPO's lovely headquarters in the Administration Building behind the state capitol in St. Paul, Minnesota. We want to acknowledge that St. Paul is the traditional homeland of the Dakota people. At last year's conference in St. Cloud, we told you about SHPO's work on a new statewide historic preservation plan. We hoped we'd have a draft ready by now, but due to the pandemic, our timeline has been extended by a year. There are still ways to engage with this process, and a draft plan will be out for public comment in mid-2021. You can sign up for SHPO's email list by visiting our webpage to subscribe. Today's session topic is Unseen Significance, Archaeology, Parks, and the National Register of Historic Places. Presenters are Kelly Wolf, Stephen Blondo, and Lindsay Reiners, all archaeologists with Blondo Consulting, and Jasmine Conker with the Science Museum of Minnesota's Department of Anthropology. Thank you, everyone, for being here. Today's discussion will be led by David Nadler, who is the National Register archaeologist for the Minnesota State Historic Preservation Office. Welcome, David.
Thank you, Leslie, and thank you everyone for joining us. I am very excited about this session. Coney Island to the west is a remarkable place, and it is an ideal example of unseen significance within the National Register of Historic Places. It was once the site of a grand hotel and resort, and the architecture of those buildings was the impetus for listing the island in the National Register in 1976, even though the architecture itself was in danger at that time. Over time, the buildings fell into disrepair and collapse, and at first glance, this would have meant that the island would be delisted from the National Register because it had lost its historical integrity. As often is the case, however, it appeared that there was great potential for other significance, in this case, largely archaeological, both related to the historical archaeology related to the hotel and resort site itself, but also very likely pre-contact American Indian archaeology that had never been assessed. In many cases, National Register listings nominations cannot consider every single aspect of potential significance at the time of evaluation and nomination, but in many cases, it's apparent that there is much more deeper there beneath the surface, or even not beneath the surface. As we discuss this topic today, Kelly Wolf will be describing the reevaluation process, and then Lindsay and Stephen will be talking about the archaeological investigations, and Jasmine will go in deeper into some of the specialist analysis of plant remains and food on the island. All of these things contribute toward the site's National Register significance under Criterion A and Criterion B. And as we go forward, the updated documentation for the National Register is in preparation. So with that, I'll turn it over to Kelly. Thank you.
Thank you, David. All right. My name is Kelly Wolf. I'm an archaeologist with Blondo Consulting. I specialize in historic archaeology, and my focus today is on Coney Island historic period of significance, which dates from 1874 to about 1960. Carver County Parks added Coney Island of the West to the Lake Waconia Regional Park proposed improvements plan. They proposed developing the island for year-round recreational use, which brought the project to the attention of the local historical society. Under state law, Minnesota Statute 138, local governments must address cultural resources, both historic structures and archaeology, prior to project development. The requirement was an easy fit as the Carver County Parks wanted to maintain the natural setting of the island and highlight its historical significance. In 2016, Carver County Parks retained Blondo Consulting in consultation with Neenah Cultural Consultants to complete cultural resources investigations on the island as part of the proposed improvement. Between 2016 and 2019, Blondo Consulting has completed multiple phases of archaeological studies, in-depth historical research analysis, and other research in order to learn more about the history of the island. Through this process, the National Register listed island was reevaluated and determined to return as a multi-component archaeological site under criterion A for its representation of significant periods in history and prehistory, and under criterion D for the potential to learn more about these histories. The town of Waconia was first platted in 1857, and by the following, much of the shore surrounding the lake was beginning to develop. As Waconia developed, the railroad was extended from Minneapolis, encouraging tourism and recreation in the area. The first documented landowners of the island was the St. Paul and Sioux City Railroad in 1868. The island was then sold in 1870 to Josephine Hassenstab, who helped to advertise the island for excursions as an extension of her family's mainland hotel. In 1884, she sold the entire island to Lambert Naegele, who was the editor of the Minneapolis Free Press at that time. Naegele lost no time, and by May 7th, 1884, he had the island platted as the town site of Coney Island of the West. It was organized into 103 lots with the large area in the center called Naegele's Park. Streets and avenues were included, and he named them for German authors, including Goethe, Uhland, Schiller, and Lessing. Naegele then began developing a resort complex at the center of the island, where he placed Coney Island Hotel. Other buildings were added, including 4 cottages, a dining hall, a pavilion, and a boathouse. By September 4, the hotel was open and ready for business. Business was really good, so a second hotel building was added in 1886, and landscape improvements was made. Many of the lots were sold by Naegele to private landowners who purchased between 1 and 4 lots at a time. A few notable families were among those who first built cabins, boathouses, and other related features across the island. Private land ownership followed societal trends in tourism and recreation. It has been said, quote, "The wealthy could make the fashionable tour in 1825. The well-to-do built up the summer resorts of the 1890s. Dick and Harry toured the country in the 1930s, thanks to the automobile." It clearly followed these trends. In 1889, Naegele sold the Coney Island Resort to Reinhold Zeglin for $10,000. Zeglin continued status as a tourist attraction and began to shape the hotel complex in his own way by adding laundry, bowling alley, dining hall, and organized concerts and other events on the island. During Zeglin's time running the hotel, guests came from all over the world. The main attraction was the island's basic rustic feel and the sense of closeness with nature that the isolated forest could provide. Rowboats were available for rent from the hotel, and people were able to fish from the docks. Patrons also enjoyed a billiards room, and a ball field was located on the eastern tip of the island. The family owned the resort into the 1920s, when it was considered the finest summer resort in Minnesota. Over time, additional improvements were made, including adding running water and indoor toilets. The Zeglins were renting between 15 and 20 cottages to tourists during the summer months. In 1943, Frank Dvorak purchased the property. He had a similar vision for the hotel complex, which was then called Paradise Island, and added a dance hall and a restaurant. His wife, Gertrude, was the chef, and her cooking famed as one of the main attractions to the resort. Around 1945, Dvorak tore the building that Naegele had built in 1886 and used the wood to construct and update around 21 cabins on the island. Dvorak's tenure was used for various proms, banquets, dances, and fundraisers. Boats, motors, and fishing equipment were all available for rent. The resort was successful, but never saw the boom years of the 1920s. By the 1960s, business began to wane and eventually closed for good. By the time of the 1976 National Register listing, lots on the island were exclusively privately owned and used for seasonal recreation. Historic archaeology involves many different techniques to interpret the past. These techniques may include the study of material culture, as well as documentary research, oral tradition and interviews, architectural studies, map analysis, site comparisons to other well-researched areas, and others. Today, the physical historic environment on the island consists of the remnants of features such as buried utilities, garden beds, pathways, standing structures, fences, and associated cultural material. These features, in combination with studying ownership changes, genealogical history, and societal trends, help to build a greater island context and history. The land can also be considered an artifact by studying the way in which the island was used, how the buildings and roadways were arranged, and how outside factors, including changes in technology, personal hygiene, use of green spaces, economics, etc., influenced that. 1976 National Register nomination form describes, quote, 40 structures, of which 13 are of relatively major size, remain today, although in a severe state of deterioration. Of the well-manicured parks, paths, and grounds, all but infrequent remnants have been engulfed under dense and uncontrolled undergrowth. Today, the island is even more overgrown, and many of the buildings once standing during that 1976 listing are just ruins. The main hotel itself, pictured here, burned down in 1994, and only the foundation and 3 remain today. The evidence of the historic period on the island includes roadways, building ruins, and vegetation. Uland Avenue is still partially discernible through the remains of concrete paving. Landscape remains also include the presence of non-native plant species such as daylilies and creeping Charlie, as well as fencing, borders, walkways lined with rock, and concrete or brick paved sidewalks. Since the island today is heavily overgrown with vegetation, historic period landscape features can be hard to distinguish. Techniques such as LiDAR can help to erase the upper vegetation layers so we can see more clearly any topographic changes, both natural and man-made. Those natural and man-made features can be clearly seen in this LiDAR map created in 2020 with the help of Jeff Jones at Archaeophysics, LLC. Focus on the historic period remains was on the ruins of the built environment. 33 ruins and other historic period features were identified and have been divided into 3 main categories: main hotel structures, hotel-related cabins or features, and private recreational cabins or features. These categories allowed for organization of the island for future management purposes and the identification of each feature with a corresponding historical narrative. Each feature was given a field number and documented, and many contain multiple associated historic ruins or features. Feature A, a privately owned cabin feature, was first sold by Naegele in 1884. Frank Hirschfield purchased the lot 6 and 7, and he is credited with building the existing cabin and matching twin boathouses on the property. He named it Gartenlaube, a take on the German word for gazebo. Hirschfield was born in Germany and immigrated to Carver County in 1878. He started a wallpapering business with his wife Elizabeth in 1894, which became the successful Hirschfield's Paint and Wall Coverings Company today, which is still family-owned. In 1915, Frank McCormick purchased the property with plans to make extensive improvements, according to the local newspaper. In 1921, he purchased the adjoining lots 8, 9, 10, and 11. He owned the property until 1941, when it was transferred to his wife Gladys, who owned it until 1945. Eventually, the property was sold in 1968 to brothers Paul and Luke Melkert, both still active community members today. An architectural survey took place in 1979 by Miller Dunwoody. They described it as, quote, one-story wood frame cabin with hip roof. The house has been considerably enlarged by later owners who built a large addition with a basement on the east end. They observed that the property had been severely vandalized, but was still structurally sound. There were 2 additional buildings, and only one of the 2 Hirschfield boathouses remained. In 2016, Blondo Consulting observed 4 structures on the property, including the main house, 2 outbuildings, and 1 boathouse. The property also contained concrete sidewalks, a wooden staircase leading down to the water, a well, and a wire fence surrounding the property. The main house was still standing but completely gutted. But in 2018, the Hirschfield cabin burned down. During the Island Park development process, the remaining portions of the buildings were removed and the foundations filled in. This process was monitored by archaeologists, and additional features were observed, including improvements, the presence of a cistern with an intact water pump, and a hand-dug well lined with yellow brick. Other recreational elements were still present, including the metal frame of a lounge chair and posts for a volleyball net. A gate in the decorative wire fence was located on the north side of the property. Near this gate was the remains of a large decorative clay flower pot. 2 test units were placed in this location during the 2019 Phase 3 mitigation, as well as shovel test 7 through 27. Feature 1 was observed in these tests and consisted of coarse gravels in a thin layer very close to the surface. At the time, it was unclear what this feature was, but based on the shape being longer than it was wide, it was thought it could be the remnants of a gravel-paved walkway or roadway. During the LiDAR and map analysis that was completed this spring, it was determined that this was the remnants of Avenue, an oval roadway that originally encircled Naegele's Park, where the main hotel complex was located. Likely, the Hirschfield property had a fenced gate on the north side of the property to access this roadway for beautification. Due to the extreme deterioration of the remaining buildings on Coney Island, they no longer retain architectural significance, which was an important element to the original 1976 listing. The historic period component of Coney Island of the West archaeological site consists of above-ground and subsurface features associated with the resort and recreational use of the island. These remains represent what is left of one of Minnesota's most popular early resort destinations and demonstrates the desire of the state's city dwellers to seek Minnesota's lakes and nature areas for recreation as early as the 1870s. Through the combination of techniques available in historic archaeology, including historical research, archaeology, and LiDAR and mapping analysis, a larger picture of the island can be told and interpreted. The island also demonstrates significance for the pre-contact period, which will be discussed next. Both periods retain most of the 7 aspects of integrity and are still considered eligible for listing in the National Register. With that, I will hand it over to Stephen Blondo and Lindsay Reiners, who will discuss the pre-contact period on the island. Thank you.
Thank you, Kelly. To get the presentation up here. We also want to thank SHPO, the State Historic Preservation Office, for hosting this event and having us here to talk about work we've done out at Coney Island. Very exciting project in the state and very exciting for archaeology in Minnesota as well. Lindsay, do you have the presentation up? I can't see it on this end, so.
I do.
Okay.
We're good to go.
All right. My name is Stephen Blondo. I'm owner and principal investigator with Blondo Consulting, LLC. I'm going to discuss the field work, the archaeological field work, and phase 1, phase 2, phase 3 that we did for archaeology. Lindsay is a prehistoric archaeologist, also a ceramic expert with the company, and she's going to be talking about what happens after the testing and some of the artifact highlights.
Sorry to interrupt. This is David. I don't see the presentation on my end. Can others see it?
Not yet.
Oh, now it's coming up. There it is.
There we go. Perfect. Great.
Thank you.
Thank you. The island is in the middle of Lake Waconia. It's surrounded by other similar island and peninsula landforms, and it's not been, the island has not been historically or recently cultivated. Dakota oral tradition suggests that Waconia is an important place. The name Waconia comes from Wachoni, which means all of life or an abundance of life, or it also may come from, or another connection is with the term Mede Waconia, Mede meaning water, as in a lake or spring, and Wakan, sacred or spirit, and Nia, to breathe. So breathing spirit or breathing sacredness through the water. The area continues to represent an intersection between environmental and geographical features, as well as through past and present technological and cultural traditions. As Kelly discussed, the Carver County Parks has added this island to its Lake Waconia Regional Park proposed improvement plan, which involves developing Coney Island of the West as part of the Lake Waconia Regional Park to provide year-round recreational opportunities for the public while maintaining the natural setting of the island and highlighting its historical significance. Besides the Architectural Survey in 1979, no other cultural resource survey, including no archaeological work, had ever taken place on Coney Island, although the area was a high potential for subsurface archaeological deposits. In 2016, a phase 1 cultural resource survey was completed to determine the presence or absence of artifacts and archaeological material. Even though there were structures and artifacts on the surface, it wasn't a guarantee that there would be intact deposits of artifacts or even features, which are concentrated use areas, subsurface. During the survey of the island, the archaeological crew crisscrossed the land, identifying above-ground foundations, artifacts, middens, etc. This was followed by shovel testing, which is the excavation of an approximately 1-foot diameter hole on a 50-foot grid. Excavated soils were screened to identify artifacts and photographs, and notes describing each were completed. Artifacts were easily separated into historic or prehistoric, pre-contact, depending on their age. Faunal material, also known as animal bones, were also important as they are evidence of historic and prehistoric diet and environment. Of the 305 shovel tests dug during phase 1, 36 contained prehistoric cultural material, evidence of a previously unknown and unrecorded pre-contact component to the island. Historic artifacts were recovered as well from the Euro-American period on the island, which was not surprising since the island had it was well known as a resort and a recreational location, a fact that was confirmed through background research and historic photographs and newspaper accounts. With the identification of an archaeological component, the island was recorded as Archaeological Site 21 CR 0164 with 3 separate components: architectural, historic, and a prehistoric culture. Table 2 shows the breakdown of the artifact assemblage for Phase 1 in prehistoric artifacts. 281 artifacts were recovered from positive shovel tests. Pre-contact artifacts recovered included stone tools, listed as lithic material, prehistoric ceramics, and faunal or animal bone. After the identification of the new Archaeological Site 21 CR 164, new questions emerged. Was the site significant? What would the artifacts and features tell us about past cultures? Who lived there? What was their lifestyle like? The Phase 2 evaluation focused on the prehistoric component of the site with the goal of determining National Register of Historic Places significance. The significance of archaeological sites is based on their ability to answer research questions and tell us about past cultures, specifically related to the island in southern Minnesota in this case. Through additional shovel testing and the excavation of larger 3-foot by 3-foot holes called test units, the horizontal and vertical size of the site was determined, and areas with concentrations of prehistoric versus historic artifacts were identified. In the end, it was determined the site had significance and integrity and should be included as an additional component in the National Register listing of the island. Through the excavation of 18 1-meter by 1-meter test units, which equaled over 150 square feet of excavation, shown in orange here, and 48 additional shovel tests, shown as red dots, 1,958 artifacts were recovered. The Phase 2 evaluation artifact assemblage showed a very similar variety to the Phase 1 collection. The artifacts assemblage included lithic material, ceramics, historic materials, firecracked rock or FCR, soil samples from 3 pre-contact features found in test units 2, 4, and 1 feature in test unit 11 were also identified. Soil samples were taken from the features and sent to the Science Museum for botanical testing. Jasmine will discuss those results later in our presentation. An abundance of faunal remains, remember animal bone, confirmed a high degree of preservation on the island, something very uncommon in Minnesota. Working with the County Parks Department, development of the island was designed to best avoid intact archaeological deposits. 100% avoidance is never possible, and a desire to highlight historic ruins and archaeological features created an opportunity to mitigate effects to the site through data recovery. The data recovery would result in information that could answer important questions before portions of the archaeological site were developed and destroyed. All work was conducted on the southern part of the island, as the northern part would later be developed. Vegetation removal was conducted simultaneously as the mitigation and construction started once testing and vegetation removal was completed. Work on the island included the identification and initial cleanup to allow for safe recreational use and the construction of a trail running generally east to west across the south side of the island, along with day use areas for picnicking and associated amenities. This map shows the trail alignment and proposed improvements. We placed our test units in places where prehistoric artifacts were unable to be avoided, or in places where we had features or diagnostic artifacts from Phase 1 and Phase 2. In the end, during Phase 3, 21 1-by-1 test units, nearly 200 square feet of excavation, was completed, and 27 shovel tests were also done. Phase 3 resulted in 1,848 artifacts recovered. The artifact assemblage is similar to other phases And here again is the breakdown. A historic feature was found in test unit 16 and test unit 21, Kelly mentioned or kind of talked about. 21 shovel tests were also dug in order to see how far the feature went. It consisted of the archaeological footprint of a historic road that was noted on historical maps and linked to the hotel era and later residences. Units were placed at the back of the Hirschfield property. It's a mix of historic artifacts and prehistoric artifacts recovered in this unit. And prehistoric artifacts included lithics and a significant ceramic find that Lindsay will talk about. Thank you. I'm going to hand this over to Lindsay to discuss more about what follows testing and what the artifacts look like and tell us about the site.
What comes after testing? In general, we do more research, interview people if necessary, analyze the artifacts, write reports, catalog the collection, and update the National Register listing. The artifacts have to go to an approved repository for storage. This collection will go to the Carver County Historical Society, which is also their first archaeological site. Once testing was complete, we moved right into construction monitoring. This included construction of the trail on the southern part of the island, asbestos abatement on some of the buildings, and demolishing some of the buildings to make them safer for the public. Here are some of the highlights from our analysis of the prehistoric artifacts. There is a diverse range of animal species represented on the island. The mammals represented include beaver, muskrat, ground squirrel, snowshoe hare, cottontail rabbit, American badger, river otter, raccoon, black bear, goat, sheep, elk, deer, and domestic pig. The bird species represented included mallard, wood duck, swan, double-crested cormorant, and great blue heron. Some of the fish species include bluegill, small sunfish, largemouth or smallmouth bass, whitesucker, northern pike, and bowfin. Some of the species can be found on Lake Waconia year-round, while others are seasonal migrators. For example, two fish species, the largemouth and smallmouth bass bones, were found in our test units and are currently present in Lake Waconia, but they are not native to Minnesota. Bowfin has never been found in Lake Waconia. Analysis of ceramics consists of looking at their temper and decoration or stylistic attributes. Temper is an additive to clay which can indicate region and time period. Shell and grit temper are represented in this ceramic assemblage. Shell temper ceramics are primarily found in northern Minnesota. The ceramic assemblage include chord marked and smooth, plane, a horizontal incised line, diagonal incised line, punctate, chord impressed, and horizontal smooth lines. When numerous ceramics are found in one level, sometimes they fit together, and sometimes there is a design that can never be seen before. In test units 16 and 21, there was a ceramic rim sherd that had a design I had never seen before. I consulted with other archaeologists, and we determined a new ceramic type that hasn't been found at other archaeological sites in Minnesota. Obviously, Waconia interior and size is named after Lake Waconia. Its design includes incised lines on the interior of the pot, and the exterior of the pot is smooth with a small edge on the lip. Waconia interior and size fills a time gap on the island between middle woodland to late prehistoric period. This new ceramic type is a huge find for Minnesota archaeology. The different ceramic stylistic attributes represent multiple time periods and design influences from the surrounding states. With different styles found on the island that aren't usually found in the area, it suggests movement or trade with other groups in the upper Midwest. Analysis of lithics consists of determining raw materials and counting points and flakes. With the number of flakes and projectile points on the island, they indicate a tool production area. The prehistoric ceramics and lithics are often found together, and the majority of prehistoric artifacts are found in areas on the island where buildings were not constructed. However, this doesn't mean that prehistoric artifacts aren't possible in those areas, but there is a lower probability. The perfect example of this is the test unit 16 and 21 that I mentioned earlier. The new ceramic type is found in this shovel test, or in this test unit, and was found in a mix of historic artifacts. The raw material primarily found on the island On the island is Prairie du Chien chert and Swan River chert. Other raw materials include, but not limited to, quartz, Knife River flint, silicified sandstone, Burlington chert, and Selkirk chert. These raw materials are found in southwestern Minnesota, but from the surrounding states as well. These include southern and eastern Iowa, central and eastern North Dakota, west central Wisconsin, northeastern Illinois, and Manitoba along the Red River. The lithic assemblage represents mainly locally sourced materials such as Prairie du Chien, while others represent exotic materials such as Burlington chert, Selkirk chert, and Knife River flint, which again would suggest movement or trade with other groups in the upper Midwest. For example, Knife River flint is only found in North Dakota. Here are some examples of the points found on the island. The prairie side notch point is a common point type that can be found all across the prairies from Saskatchewan and Alberta into Montana, North and South Dakota, and into the plains of Colorado, Nebraska, Kansas, and Minnesota. Madison projectile points are common throughout the Midwestern region and tend to be concentrated along the Mississippi River basin. So, what does this all mean? This research in over 4,000 artifacts adds important context to the prehistory and history of the site, thus creating a better understanding of the site's significance. Here is a map showing the areas where movement or trade could have occurred based on the stylistic attributes of the ceramics, the raw materials, and projectile points. These investigations concluded the island contains a multi-component archaeological site with an intact subsurface pre-contact component. With the presence of certain ceramic styles and projectile points, the pre-contact component dates to the terminal woodland tradition through the late prehistoric period. Table 4 depicts some of the pre-contact traditions in which the island is associated with. The artifact assemblage indicates the island was utilized during the pre-contact period and the historic period. As a result, Coney Island of the West continues to be eligible under Criterion A for association with events that made a significant contribution to history, and Criterion D for potential to yield additional information on the history and prehistory of the area. Currently, Carver County Parks has been able to successfully avoid impacts to many of the historic and prehistoric components of the site and continues to consult with interested parties as to the future of Coney Island of the West historic property. The southern part of the island is open to the public. Carver County Historical Society is working on an exhibit for Coney Island and is hoping to open that exhibit later this year. Thank you. Jasmine will talk about the botanical finds now.
There. Thank you. My name is Jasmine Conker. I'm an research assistant at the Science Museum in Minnesota, and I will be talking about the remains that came from 3 features from the Coney Island of the West site. 9 samples came to the Science Museum, and we processed them through flotation. So the site form does date, as Lindsay and Stephen said, approximately late woodland to late pre-contact. So the objective of my analysis of the plant remains was to be able to provide a plant inventory from these features to be able to understand kind of what was the plant use done from the site. The 3 features that I analyzed, feature 1 was unit 2, approximately 35 centimeters by 40 centimeters. Possibly a late woodland feature because there was late woodland ceramics in the surrounding unit, and 7 samples came from that feature. Feature 2 came from there was 1 soil sample from there, and the feature was in the south half of the unit. Feature 3 came from test unit 4, and again another soil sample, and that was in the northeast corner of the unit, and it was approximately 20 centimeters by 40 centimeters. So the paleoethnobotany in the area, having paleoethnobotany inventories to compare sites against each other at times can be really hard since there are not many botanical inventories done. This is because of the time intensity of gathering the soil matrix, having access to be able to begin to process the samples and then conducting an analysis. However, we are very fortunate enough that there was a paleoethnobotany inventory of the nearby site of Coney Island. Coney Island is roughly 9 kilometers away from the Halstead Bay sites. In 2002, in Halstead Bay, which is on the west side of Lake Minnetonka, a series of sites were dug. 119 samples were collected from those sites for a paleoethnobotany inventory, and they were sorted and analyzed from the sites. Ron Shermer did a study in the macrobotanical assemblages from those sites that are a late woodland series. So we use that paleoethnobotany inventory as a comparison with using the Coney Island. These assemblages are not comparable in size, and the specific inventories do differ, but the broad contents are in some ways very similar. That is, both the Coney Island site and Halstead Bay sites are lakeside habitations situated in the southern part of Minnesota, occupied roughly during the same time periods. The wood assemblage does reflect the immediate local environments of the two sites. Firewood is obtained in the vicinity of all sites. Both non-wood assemblages present a mix of reliance on cultivated and locally available gathered plant resources, but with the cultivated plants making up a small minority of the substance base. In both cases, wet-tolerant gathered species dominate the non-wood assemblage. This is a reflection of the lakeside location on both localities. Sample 7 from feature 1 and 1 sample for each feature 2 and feature 3 were hand floated for flotation. Each sample was processed individually to ensure that there was no cross-contamination. Bondo consulted by volume of each sample to be put through flotation, and the other third of the sample would be returned to them and be archived. Non-carbonized material, recent plant remains, plant roots, bark, and unburnt seams were removed and discarded. The material from the 10 mesh or above the wood was sorted for wood and non-wood. Wood material that was not identified below this mesh because it was very hard to identify it. Non-wood material includes seeds from other non-woody plant parts. Wood remains are those that come from branches and trunks of deciduous and coniferous trees. Dr. Ronald Shermer from Minnesota State University Mankato, he is a paleoethnobotanical expert, was consulted to assist with identifying any problematic specimens as needed. The 1975 map of vegetation are based on the notes that were taken during the mid-19th century and can be a useful tool to help understanding the landscape of the centuries leading up to industrialization. Marshner indicated that the surrounding lakeshore and the island where the sites are located have the big woods environment: oak, elm, maple, basswood. The wood charcoal in the assemblage of Coney Island is consistent with the environmental mosaic. The tree species represented include a variety of elm, slippery elm, American elm, maple variety, and American hornbeam. All species expected to exist in the island currently or during historic times. At the Halstead Bay site, the site was dominated by white oak, ironwood, red oak, basswood, and slippery elm. This is different than the Coney Island site. However, it is an island site, and there are trees that are more wet tolerant than it can be. Typically, most fuel sources are from very close by. The 8 grams of charcoal from the site gives us a small look into the trees that they selected to burn for fuel. Even though there is no oak, ironwood, or basswood, such as they are at the Halstead Bay site, that does not mean that they do not exist in other features that could be present at the site. Again, as a reminder, this is a small sample. The Halstead Bay site does also fall under the Marshner pattern of the big woods environment. From 4 5-centimeter levels were examined from feature 1. All levels contained wood charcoal. The quantity of wood charcoal by weight varied by level, with 40 to 50 centimeters bearing the most. 5 varieties of wood species were present. All 5 varieties were present for feature 1. Elm variety, slippery elm, American elm, maple variety, and American hornbeam. The second and third levels, 45 to 55 centimeters, both have 4 species present. And then the fourth level, from 55 to 60, only has the 3 varieties: slippery elm, American elm, and the maple variety. Feature 2 was the only other feature that had a presence of wood. With only having 1 sample, there was only 1 piece of charcoal that was present from the elm variety. And feature 3 also had 4 pieces of unidentified wood. Categorized as those remains that are from non-woody or reproductive parts of plants. Most often, non-wood assemblages consist of seeds, although rinds and cobs are sometimes preserved as well. Non-wood specimens tend to be plants that are gathered or grown to be consumed for specific cultural uses. All features contain non-wood botanical material. Cultigens present in the assemblage include maize, wild rice. Non-cultigens include goosefoot, wild cucumber or burr cucumber, fungus fruit bodies, carbonized fungus, pinweed, and dwarf ginseng. The goosefoot is a well-known cultigen grown in the eastern and Midwest of the United States during the pre-contact times. However, Chaetopodium seeds from the Coney Island site are from the wild variety. These have rounded seed margins as opposed to the truncated margins that are found in the domestic. At the Halstead Bay site, the only common non-wood plant that these sites have is the fungus and maize. Non-cultigens at the Halstead Bay site are nutgrass tubers, hognose peanut tubers, and yellow water lily tubers, eldermarsh, dogwood nutlets, walnuts, acorns, hawthorn, large grass seeds, and celery leaf, buttercup, and rose nutlets. Cultigens present there at the Halstead Bay site are squash and gourd and maize. Squash and gourd have been noted to be found in late woodland sites. Maize has also been present in woodland sites, but not in large frequency and density as those in late pre-contact villages. Four levels of feature 1, with the top level 40 to 45 centimeters containing the most variety and concentration. Maize kernels and cupulas were both present in the top 2 levels, wild rice only being in the top level, and other non-cultigens occurred throughout the entire feature. This feature is most likely consistent from a late woodland context. This is because of the grit-tempered ceramic body shear that was found from 15 to 40 centimeters in the surrounding unit. Being able to actually inventory a late woodland feature is actually very exciting. As stated above, the features 2 and consists of a single sample of 5 centimeters. The non-wood assemblage for feature 2 only includes goosefoot and unidentified seeds. Feature 3 has a single maize kernel and fungus root bodies and carbonized fungus. Feature 2 has ceramics that are from the late woodland to late pre-contact. There is a lot of grit-tempered ceramics, cord-marked body sherds, and incised rims and near rims. Feature 3 has no ceramics possible time period. Since both features have only a single partial sample to give us a scope of what the plant use is, it is more possible that there is much more botanical remains that can help us understand what is the plant use there. In botanical assemblage from the local environment and the woodland to late pre-contact period occupied at the site. The wood species by are comparable with the island setting being with the broader big woods and ecological zone indicated by Marshner, indicating a similar forest environment during the site's occupation. Likewise, the occupants of the site made use of wet-tolerant species like wild rice, dwarf ginseng, This is also expected to be given in an island setting. Maize and wild rice are both present at the Coney Island site, were critical substance grains of the cultural importance among those committed to manage and maintain them. The presence of maize indicates horticultural activities occurred either at or near the site among interacting parties. Maize cannot grow wild and requires commitment of time and resources to cultivate. Wild rice, a substance staple beginning during the woodland period and continuing throughout the contact era into present day, was once abundant across most of Minnesota. Currently, or at least within the recent past, wild rice has occurred naturally in Carver County and other parts of southern Minnesota. Both maize and wild rice became increasingly important during the woodland and late pre-contact periods in Minnesota. The level to which the occupants of Coney Island participate in the of one or the other can only speculate by the presence of both feature one. Both wild rice appear to have consumed at Coney Island, but it is impossible to know if they were traded or harvested locally. But the presence of natural and surrounding counties in recent times makes it highly possible that the occupants at Coney Island partook in the processing of harvesting and processing. The Coney Island and Halstead Bay sites both have the presence of mage, which is not uncommon for a late woodland time period. Even though the rest of the non-woodland appellant assemblage differ, they do have the same sense of being more wet tolerant. As Dr. Sherman mentioned in his report for the Halstead Bay, with having maize being in more than one feature presents the idea that maize was more systematically integrated into late woodland plant use than what was commonly believed. I believe the Coney Island could be to support this, even with the small sample that we have present from these three features. And that's what I have. Thank you.
I wanted to say thank you so much to all the presenters. This is really wonderful information. Appreciate it. Thanks also to all the participants who have joined. We have about 10 minutes for questions and discussion.
And I'll just take over from here. We have one question, it looks like, in our Q&A section, but please feel free to add any questions you may have for the presenters. Starting with the question we have here, I believe it was during your presentation, Stephen, you were mentioning shovel tests. Can you talk about the depth of those shovel tests?
Yeah, thank you. Oh, all right. Well, thank you, Leslie.
There you go.
Am I off mute? I guess.
Yep, we see
There
you.
we go. Okay. Thank you. Yeah. So the depth of shovel testing, it kind of depends on where you're shovel testing at. You want to get into intact subsurface soils that are. Oh, am I there? Okay. So soils that are pre-cultural soils. You want to get into subsoil. At Waconia, soils vary depending on there's a lot of topographic feature to that island. So there's a higher area and there's lower areas. There's sand, and so you want to get into those subsoils that you know are that are pre-cultural soils that were laid down prior to the glacier. In the case, in generally speaking, a shovel test will go no more than maybe say 3 feet or a meter. At that point in time, it's hard to get the soil small, but you can do some deep testing beyond that if you need to. Or I think at Coney Island, most everything was within probably 1 foot to 2 foot that we were digging, and then we were into the subsoil.
Okay, thanks for that answer, Stephen. We have another question here as to whether there was community or public engagement with this project, if there was some sort of public involvement. Not sure who's appropriate to answer that one.
I can answer that one. We did coordinate Carver County Parks. They put on a couple of volunteer events to help with cleanup on the island, because there's a lot of historic debris, broken glass, rusty metal, all things that could be dangerous to the public when they open the park. So we did do some volunteer cleanup events in that sense, but we haven't done any public archaeology type events on the island as to date. But could be potential in the future if the parks was open to that.
Thanks for that, Kelly. Here's another question. Was it ever determined that wolves were present on the island?
I'll let Kelly, do you want to do you have any thoughts on that?
As for the faunal assemblage we found in the test units, no bulls were found within, or there were no representations for bones on the island of wolves. I don't know the historical record if it says anything about wolves being on the island, Kelly.
I didn't see anything in the record
I know Wendy had
research. Haven't done analysis for the phase 3 yet, so we still might find some bone related to that. But as far as I know, Stephen, Wendy had a story from the Historical Society, didn't she?
Yeah, so there's a discussion from Mr. Peterson, who's the guy out there with the Peterson farm, and he talks about oversized dogs or aggressive dogs that the way he describes it, it sounds like a wolf, but nothing in the archaeological record yet to confirm that. So
Okay, thanks for that. While we're waiting for more questions along those lines, I had a question. I thought I heard a statement that that faunal remains or materials are uncommon in Minnesota. Did I hear that right? And why would that be? I think maybe Stephen, you might have said that.
I did say that because so in order for bone to survive, especially when you're looking at 1,000+ year survival, soil conditions have to be just right. If soils are acidic, if soils are too wet, too dry, bone doesn't survive. And the amount of faunal material that is present at Coney Island and has survived, just and the variety is an absolutely amazing collection. Is rare, if not very uncommon, if not rare, in Minnesota. So it's another another nod to the importance of the site and significance of the site.
Thank you, Stephen. Here's another question about consultation or engagement. Did you consult with any tribes for their interest that they might have in this project?
Yes, we've been in touch with the Dakota communities and letting them know what we're doing out there, asking for any input they might have. The fact that this is a significant, the name alone shows the significance and importance to the Dakota community. We were really looking for a lot of oral tradition that might help kind of solidify and help to explain some of what we were finding. There have been site visits from a number of tribal members that have come out to see what we were doing, and a lot of discussion about to them. Is there anything that can explain some of what we're finding through, not just ethnographic record, which of course is oral tradition written down by historic people, but also just what it may mean in a to them in a context with the Dakota. Yes.
Okay, thank you, Stephen. We have a question from Jason Reichel. Which types of pre-contact pottery wares were identified or are suspected at the site, such as Cathio, Sandy Lake, etc.?
We suspect that Sandy Lake is and then as well as Fox Lake. Then we also have ceramics that are similar to the Missouri River Valley in South Dakota. I can't remember what that type is off the top of my head, but definitely Fox Lake and Lake is an influence ceramics.
Okay, thank you. Looks like we have time for one more question. Was there an attempt to differentiate faunal remains associated with the prehistoric component from the faunal remains associated with the historic component? So prehistoric versus historic.
Lindsay, do you want to? There was we have a faunal report. Let me start maybe, and then I'll hand it off to you, Lindsay. We do have a faunal study from the phase 1 and phase 2. We did do an attempt to differentiate, of course, with just some species that are present. So when you're finding sheep or goat, which are not native to the island, of course, that's part of the historic component. But Lindsay or Kelly, do you have any other answer to that?
There were a few bone modifications that we found in the assemblage. I can't remember off the top of my head the results exactly, but we did have some bone modification. But for the historic, I know we tried to compare it to like historic menus and stuff like that from the restaurant, but those haven't really found their way over to Carver County Historical Society. So kind of hard to determine that.
Okay, thank you, Lindsay. It looks like we're at 11. Well, we're at a minute after 11, but I did just want to quickly mention, it looks like in the chat function that there's a comment that an exhibit will open November 10th at the Science Museum of Minnesota. Do I have that right, Jasmine?
It's at the Carver County Historical Society.
Okay, good. Thanks for clarifying that. Okay, thanks everyone.
Leslie, one final announcement. This is Michael Coop from SHPO. Just hoping that folks will be interested in joining us for our 6th and final presentation, the session this Thursday, October 1st, on equity and preservation planning, which will focus on a really interesting historic and cultural context that the city of St. Paul did on African American residents there. And if you wanted more information about that, you can go to our conference webpage. But we hope you'll join us for that. Thanks.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.